last on our agenda, we have PLANWake, Wake County Planning, Development, and Inspections Office here. We have Terry Nolan, the Planner 3. And we also have, I know, I think I see her on the call, Sharon Peterson, our Long Range Planning Administrator as well, both from Wake County Planning. And they're going to give us an update on the PLANWake. They may actually have some news for us about the Wake County Commissioners meeting yesterday and maybe what happened with PLANWake. So I'm not going to take that from them, but I'll let them update us and what the future holds for Wake County and the planning and looking at agriculture and trying to preserve that as much as we can. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Terry.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We are happy to be here and want to concentrate more on some of the next steps, because the good news is our Board of Commissioners did make a motion to adopt this plan at their regular meeting on Monday. Because we're holding our meetings virtually, this topic is actually going to carry over into the next regularly scheduled BOC meeting for formal adoption, but it was good news, and our commissioners had a lot of very good things to say about PLANWake, and had some comments related to preserving agriculture and maintaining some of our open spaces. So just real quickly, PLANWake is it's a high-level policy guide to help us guide our future and really kind of ask these questions. Wake County is growing very rapidly, about 62 people per day, and we will add an additional 250,000 people over the next decade. So how do we plan for those additional people? How do we provide transportation, housing, and the services that shall be needed? We did a lot of outreach during this 2-year process, most of it done pre-COVID. And what came out of our community engagement is that there were 4 key community preferences that people said that they wanted. They felt that significant change is needed to plan for growth, that they want to see open space and natural areas protected, that they'd like to see new growth directed to existing towns and cities, and they want to see more walkable environments. And these are kind of the 4 guiding principles that really have guided this process. So PLANWake contains 3 major components: key vision outcomes that are meant to guide our decision making, a development framework map, which identifies the areas where we want to direct growth and what the character of those areas would look like, and then metrics so that we can track and measure our progress in meeting our objectives. And the comprehensive plan topics are dealt with at a very high level and focus on the outcomes that we want to achieve, and kind of understand that the implementation will be carried out through what we would call operational plans. So we care about affordable housing. Our affordable housing plan is going to have really the details for how we're going to meet those objectives. Same goes for our rural economic development plan that will help carry out and more specifically implement some of the things that we're recommending here. PLANWake is about growing intentionally to make sure the costs and benefits are equitable throughout Wake County. It contains these 6 high-level policies. These policies were contained in the old 1990s land use plan, and during the many months of COVID, we spent a good deal of time, our project team and stakeholders, in hammering out how are these policies going to carry over into PLANWake, given the kind of the new framework and the new direction that we want to go as a county. I'll touch on 2 of them. With the water supply watersheds, and we have several in Wake County. It is our recommendation that the basic way that we manage our water supply watersheds does not change. So we manage our watersheds as a very low density use, that we do not allow public utilities to be in the watersheds, and that is to protect the water quality. PLANWake carries forward that basic recommendation. And then with extraterritorial jurisdiction, or ETJ, some people may be familiar with this. So the land use plan contains criteria for how the Board of Commissioners should evaluate requests from municipalities for extending ETJ. And while it is certainly still very important for municipalities to have ETJ so that they can plan for growth and plan for infrastructure. We changed some of our criteria to really try and stress and encourage smaller, more targeted ETJ requests from municipalities. We want to have stronger collaboration between the county and municipalities so that these are targeted and really well planned for, well thought out places for municipal growth. So we have a heavy lift after the plan is officially adopted. First, we need to look at our UDO, our Unified Development Ordinance, and revise our UDO to help carry out some of the recommendations in the plan. We're seeking to do better with protecting our natural resources. So we will be looking at the UDO, which details our development and design specifications. We will look to update area plans. We have several area plans that are pretty old, and area planning is an important way to engage the landowners and the residents at a smaller level and really kind of get into more of the details of what do these areas need, where should they go, and then also looking at what tools are we going to use for these vision outcomes. We look to strengthen our tools that support rural economies. We have discussed at length with our rural stakeholders, including the Voluntary Ag District Board, soil and water conservation, having discussions about what the rural areas are going to need. We've also done some initial look at some other models that are out there in the country that we may want to adopt here in terms of how do we support our rural economies. And then we have some kind of basic metrics that we identified in our plan for, how do we want to measure our success. We will continue to add some new metrics and decide how we're going to track and report on those on an annual basis so that we can look at how we're doing and implement new tools as they're needed. In terms of recommendations in PLANWake, there aren't a lot of very specific recommendations, although with supporting rural working lands, PLANWake is probably it probably goes into the greatest specificity when it comes to rural working lands and what we can and should do to support farms and working lands. And these are basically generally what was recommended in the plan. What we heard during our process from rural landowners and rural residents are kind of these bullet points right here. People were very concerned with trespassing on their land, people coming onto their land and shooting guns, encroachment, which they kind of saw as subdivisions that were popping up in these rural areas that were creating concerns in terms of traffic and stormwater impacts from nearby development. We heard a lot about stormwater impacts, and we've made some process changes already. So now we include soil and water conservation staff when we look at proposed development. So they are included in those discussions about, a new development is being proposed in the rural areas. They have some input on, how some stormwater impacts may be mitigated through that. People have voiced concern about having their land in a municipal ETJ. State law does offer some protections for people that have working lands, but we did hear people were concerned about the regulations that might come from the municipalities in being in an ETJ. That's one reason why we changed some of our criteria to try and be more mindful of the lands and the landowners that wish to remain in rural areas and wish to remain farming. That we want to be mindful of what it means to be in an ETJ. And then we heard kind of these other two things, options for retirement and options for the next generation. And the other presenters that we heard from today offered a lot of programs that people may be interested in that give people options, for rather than having to sell their land to a developer, which they may not want to do, ways that they can still get value from their land if they don't wish to continue farming, as well as how to make sure that the next generation has the right tools, has the right training, knows what their options are to continue that farming operation. So these are the main concerns that we heard throughout our process. We intend to continue to engage rural landowners and our other stakeholders like TLC, Soil and Water Conservation, and Voluntary Ag District as we move forward into the next steps. I am curious if anyone wants to comment. We have a lot that we need to do in the next, after our plan is adopted to carry out what's being recommended in the plan. So how might we prioritize what we do next? If someone wants to add a comment in the chat, if you're watching, be interested in hearing your feedback on, where do we start? We need to tackle it all, but what might be a good priority to programs and training to support farming, and that includes, beefing up our open space program for purchase of lands or conservation easements, as well as concentrating on training the next generation of farmers. Number two, changing county development standards to protect neighboring farmlands and discouraging encroachment. That could be things like making sure that there are adequate buffers between new development and existing farmlands, or possibly changing the yield that a developer might get, or protecting large tracts of intact natural area, canopy, tree canopy, those types of things. And third, encouraging growth in municipal areas to take the pressure off of rural areas. We identified areas that could see a lot more growth, and we're not talking about tall towers everywhere, but there are areas that are underutilized within Wake County that could see redevelopment, infill, particularly around transit corridors and major interchanges on the highway. That could, if we went a little bit denser in those areas, could help take some of the pressure off those rural areas. We're interested in continuing our conversation with stakeholders. This is my contact information, as well as Sharon Peterson, who's been with the county for a long time and has greater expertise and institutional knowledge than I do in terms of what we have used and what could be used. Our final plan is on our project website at planwake.org. There's also a link to an interactive development framework map. You can click on that link and you can zoom in and out, and you can see what the development framework is. You can also search for your property and see where you fall into it in terms of, is it an area where we anticipate a lot of growth in the near future, or is it an area that we'd like to see remain more rural, see less growth in those areas. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, Awesome job, Terry. That's a great presentation. So great slides and great information too for those. So I know it may take a minute for Michaela to just any questions that come in or that may be typing in. So you see anything yet, Michaela?
I don't see any at this moment, but I'll give
Okay.
individuals a minute or two.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up with Terry because I know she said it'd be great to get feedback on sort of the priorities. And I don't want to speak for all the farming and ag community, but I will speak for behalf of the ones that I have been trying to help. And I actually had one yesterday approach me again and was showing me a new subdivision and the impacts they were having to his farm and his crop fields due to the runoff again. It's a brand new one that I visited yesterday. And so I think in my eyes, and I'm just gathering just the data that I have as director of soil and water and the amount of calls that I received and people that's reached out to our office for assistance, I would think that changing the county development standards to protect neighboring farms is probably the most prioritized number one for that going forward. Just because when that happens, there's a lot of damage to the farm, and especially if it's crop fields, or there's a lot of damage, erosion, stormwater runoff, and things that are causing damage to those farms. And I think there's a high susceptibility of that farm failing because of that damage. As you look at farm and farmers, with weather and with the natural disaster events, it's hard enough to farm and to make a profit. But when you're having to battle the weather, natural disasters, maybe insects or anything that could happen that year on your farm, but also trying to battle development next door that is also causing resource concerns, nutrient runoff, erosion, problems, because the farmer needs good quality soil to grow crops and to be productive and to keep that farm productive. And when those resources are washed away or depleted or affected in some way due to runoff, it does impact them long term. So that's just this how I feel for the planning and looking at it from our office, because that is our biggest clients is farm and agriculture producers in the county. And I feel like there's a threatened nature there for a lot of people, because the ones that's calling me is not just one farmer, but it's numerous farmers over a whole area that are being impacted, and they just don't have the resources or the money to help treat and address that stormwater runoff that's now coming through their property, and they're having to take it out of their coffers and their money to try to address that. So I look at that as being the number one priority that I think that we could really help with initially. And then I think, now that y'all have identified those rural areas and the open space funds for conservation easements, I think that would be the next one is, now that we have these open space funds and these bonds and stuff, how can we prioritize and purchasing, conservation easements to protect, vital farmland? Maybe looking at the soils and looking at which ones are really rich and very productive soils for farmland and rural areas. And how can we protect those and maybe purchasing those conservation easements to make sure that we do have this viable farmland for generations and that it's not gone. It's sort of like when Jason Page was given his presentation, you got to have a plan in place in an event something may happen, and so that you don't get kind of caught after the fact and wishing that you did, and it be physically impossible to come back from that. And I think PLANWake does a great job, and I commend all of you for doing the job you've done of creating this. But I think it's our plan of what we can do now. Let's have this plan now and not wait 10 years when it's just financially unreliable or feasible to purchase these easements because it's just too expensive or what the case may be. And then we're kind of behind the eight ball. We're just too late to do that. So, but I commend y'all. And as you know, updating the county UDO updates and stuff, y'all have a lot of this part was just probably easy getting it approved. Now y'all have a large workload of now getting it done, right? So there's a lot of stuff that people don't know. Now you've got a huge workload to get this done, but Soil and Water certainly wants to work with y'all with those updates and how we can work together to accomplish all of those things that you've said, Terry. So great job.
Thank you.
And we did have one comment coming in from Evan. He mentions that other counties in the state provide county funds to match state and federal funds for conservation easements. These funds could further incentive landowners to consider conservation easements. don't know if you'll have any comments to that, but.
No, I don't. Teresa, are you familiar whether or not the county has any funds available?
The only funds that I know that's available, and Lynn could probably jump in as well, because I was trying to get tying it all in together, would be the open space funds that is currently within the Wake County Parks and Recreation Open Space Program.
Yeah.
Those funds have been used mainly for, like I said, buying up property. It's actually preserving and buying land. I know they have done some easements, but I don't think they've done many easements, more so actually buying land. Lynn could probably help me, but I know Triangle Land Conservancy actually partners with the Wake County Open Space and trying to utilize those county funds along with the state funds, like you were talking about, Evan was talking about, and the federal funds. All those funds, as you know, Wake County land is expensive. We have to have multiple sources of funds to make a project happen. So, but Leanne, I know you're an expert on this. If you want to expand on that any.
Yeah, those funds have been used sometimes for conservation easements, and we've partnered with the county on those projects, but a lot of that funding has already been allocated. So I would just really second that it would be great to have a county resource dedicated specifically to farmland easements. Several of our neighboring counties have that, and it's enabled a lot of farmland protection work and the ability for us to leverage these state and federal resources.
Right. And I think the funds that we typically use are those that are coming from bond referendums and not necessarily dedicated county funds that are set aside as part of the budget.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah. A good question, Evan. So, and one thing we need to work on, and maybe we can do that through this PLANWake as well. Maybe that's something that we can highlight, that there's a needed resource and funds dedicated just for that. Like I said, you know how long and time it takes with budgets to make things happen and get funds set aside. So I think we need to start that planning process now and making sure that we try to get some of that set aside. Because it does, as Leanne showed you the timeline, sometimes with closing these easements, it's not a very short turnaround time to make sure everything's in place and like it should be. So Michaela, do you see anything else?
Yes, there was a comment from Joni in regards to your priorities question, Terry. She said she ditto to what Teresa said earlier, but she mentioned specifically urban sprawl encroaching and negatively impacting farmland and agriculture communities and the lack of realistic buffers between the development and the farmland.
Yeah, I did have a farmer let me know yesterday, that was one of his concerns and was wondering, he said, during your conversations, if you could, maybe there would be a buffer between the two land uses, because a lot of times the houses are built right on the property line. There's not much buffer. And one of the instances that I went to, I think the new subdivision, you could walk right out the back door and you were in the cornfield right next, so there was no buffer whatsoever between the two. And maybe having that buffer for many reasons. Number one, having a buffer between the land uses, but that also helps treat that stormwater and flowing through that buffer area before it reaches another person's property that could adversely impact that person's property. So looking at those options, I think will be a great, and during that process is maybe updating that UDO as well. So great comment, Joni. I know you would be on here.
She did have one more comment to share. She agreed with the idea of cities and municipalities being required to build up within that existing city limit to take some of the pressure off of farmland.
Right. And that's a good point. And you have to realize that development is coming and people are moving in at a faster rate, and it's going to happen. So how do we still let that happen, but still also preserve those rural areas? So, and that's one good thing I think the PLANWake has put in there, is having that option to be able to, do that, push more development back into the centers of the municipality. So, and keep that pressure off for as long as we can. So, and it could also help us, give us more time in these rural areas to people that may want to do conservation easements or have an interest in preserving those farms, that we could work with and have time to secure funding for those kind of easements and things. So it gives us more time to do that as well, and takes the pressure off. Because I do hear a lot of my farmers, one that the same guy that I saw yesterday said, he got an offer and the developers called him, almost monthly, write him and say, offer him X amount of money as often as possible. And so they do have those pressures constantly, and it's in the millions, as you know. I know his was in the millions. If you will sell, all you have to do is sign today. Here's 1.5 million, 2 million. And so those pressures do exist on existing landowners in Wake County. So, very good question. So,
yeah, Teresa, if I can just follow up on that, because one of the what we've heard during the process is having farmers saying that they want some flexibility with not too many regulations, because they want the opportunity to be able to sell if there's some family emergencies or some transfer is in the offing, to be too regulated. And so we've kind of trying to work with farmers, the farming community, to determine kind of what priorities should we have along those lines as well.
I agree, Sharon, and I've heard those concerns as well. Most of the, as you know, the large landowners that are in forest or in farming agriculture uses, their most assets they have is in their land. It's not financial money or as far as cash, but it's in the land as their inheritance or their money and their life savings. Is everything they've got is tied up in that land, and so they do want to have that flexibility and not have those rights taken away in case something does happen. So, and I definitely want to be courteous of that, because it is there and it is their choice for that. So, and I think there's room for both. And I've heard from both, and I've heard from some that want to protect it, long term, and then some that just will not be able to tie that up for their ancestors as well. So, good point too. It's a good topic. We could talk about this one for hours, I know. So.